Hello, and thank you for tuning in to this video series. My name is Eric Grossman. I'm a Sanctions Compliance Officer here at the Office of Foreign Assets Control, or more commonly known as OFAC. In this informational series, we are going to walk through who we are, what we do, and how we interact with you in our day-to-day work. And we're going to explain OFAC's role in advancing U.S. foreign policy and national security. First, you might be wondering if this series is for you. This series may be useful to anyone who encounters OFAC sanctions in their work and wants to learn more about us, or for anyone who has questions about OFAC sanctions compliance expectations, or even if you're just curious about sanctions after hearing so much about them in the news. Our goal in these next few episodes is for you to leave with a better understanding of what OFAC is and how it operates, how sanctions work, how to comply with OFAC sanctions, and how to get in touch with OFAC if you have any questions. Be sure to keep an eye out for when those new episodes release. We're going to cover some fairly niche information about OFAC in this series. In doing so, we may reference specific sanctions programs as examples, but for this series, we're not going to be going into detail about any single sanctions program. That said, please let us know if there are any other OFAC topics you'd like to learn more about in the future. For now, we're here to cover the basics. Consider it a sort of OFAC 101. And here's what that's going to look like in these next few episodes. First, we'll give an overview of OFAC and explain our role in sanctions and how we operate. Then we'll explore where you, as someone working in the private sector, are most likely to come into direct contact with us. We'll discuss sanctions compliance techniques, the mechanics of applying for a license, what to do once you've spotted some activity that you think involves one of our sanctions programs, and what OFAC enforcement looks like. Now, as we do all of that, throughout this series, we may use some fictional examples for these foundational topics as we get you up to speed. But we want to point out that sanctions are an extremely serious matter, both because they are often an attempt to stop reprehensible behavior like human trafficking, but they are also very serious from the perspective of your average unsanctioned person who needs to be aware of and comply with sanctions. Penalties for non-compliance may vary depending on the violation, but it could ultimately result in a monetary penalty or even a referral to the Department of Justice for criminal prosecution. Sanctions and sanctions compliance are not to be taken lightly, but our goal here is to break these topics down into something that is digestible and easily shared throughout your organizations. Now, before we get into the meat of this presentation, I must properly caveat. The information in this series is for training purposes only. Nothing said here as the force of law. None of it supplements or modifies the statutes, regulations, executive orders, or other authorities that govern sanctions administered by OFAC. Also, any and all of this may be subject to change, and it is only current as of today. In short, this is an informal, introductory video series. Now, with all of that said, let's get into it. So, before you can start complying with sanctions, it might help to know what are sanctions really, and what's a sanctions program? When OFAC refers to sanctions, it's generally talking about a series of prohibitions preventing U.S. persons from engaging in certain activities that involve targeted persons or locations. Now, when we say person, we use it as a catch-all term for individuals or entities, like a company. And it's important to know that the prohibitions generally extend to any transaction involving the U.S. financial system, which usually means a U.S. person or bank is somehow involved in the transaction, even if the underlying activity and involved parties are located abroad. For instance, if a U.S. dollar transaction between two non-U.S. parties clears through a U.S. bank, that transaction would be subject to our prohibitions. Now, as you may know, OFAC sanctions can be against listed persons or involve an entire region or country, like you see with our sanctions targeting Iran or North Korea, for example. It really depends on the reason for each set of sanctions, or sanctions program, as we call it. Our sanctions programs are not one size fits all. They're custom made because each program is designed to address specific foreign policy goals and national security priorities. That's also why we have so many programs. We have a lot of goals, Right now, we have over 35 different programs. Now, the goal of one of those programs might be to prevent certain people who have done certain bad things from abusing the US financial system, while the goals of another might be to deprive an entire regime of the money it needs to finance its bad behavior. Now, broadly speaking, OFAC sanctions come in two flavors: blocking and non-blocking. Blocking refers to sanctions that require US persons to block, which is essentially freezing, all property or interests in property that are in the United States or later come within the United States or the possession or control of a US person. And any property that is blocked must be reported to OFAC. This kind of sanction also generally prohibits all dealings involving the blocked person's property or interests in property. So that's pretty broad, and it usually means OFAC will add that blocked person to OFAC's specially designated nationals and blocked persons list, more commonly known as the SDN list. There are other lists that we refer to as non-SDN lists, but we'll cover that more later on. So, if you're on the SDN list, you don't get to access the US financial system anymore. I should also mention here that we have what's called OFAC's 50% rule, and it typically applies to the SDN list. That rule says that those same blocking requirements that affect the listed person also apply to entities that are owned 50% or more by that person, or by a combination of blocked persons, directly or indirectly, even if that entity isn't specifically named on the SDN list. So now let's look at that other flavor of OFAC sanctions, and that's non-blocking sanctions. The important thing to note here is that this kind of sanction, the prohibitions don't necessarily require the outright blocking of property, but they do involve some other kind of economic restrictions, like no dealing in securities issued by a specific person, for example. So if persons are listed on one of OFAC's other sanctions lists, one of those non-SDN lists I referred to earlier, then they might still be allowed to access the US financial system, but with some strict limitations. As with blocking sanctions, non-blocking sanctions may apply to a specific person, including individuals or entities, or to a region or an entire country. For location-specific non-blocking prohibitions, US persons may be, for example, prohibited from engaging in certain types of activities involving any person located in the named region or country, or involving a good or service from that region or country, like oil exports from a country, or even an entire sector of a country's economy, like the energy sector, or, most broadly of all, the sanctions might target all imports of goods or services from and exports to a specific country. The key thing to note is that when an activity is prohibited by one of these non-blocking prohibitions, a US business may not be required to block any involved assets, but they should not engage in that activity. For financial institutions, if they see a transaction relating to that prohibited activity, they should reject that transaction and return the funds to the originator. But non-blocking prohibitions may take a variety of forms, so you'll want to review the specific sanctions in order to see exactly what is required. Remember, with both of these types of sanctions, blocking and non-blocking, you cannot rely solely on screening your activity against OFAC's sanctions list to prevent sanctions violations. You should do your due diligence to understand potential exposure to a particular sanctions program and the particular prohibitions that may be implicated. So, once you or someone at a financial institution or other organization identifies activity involving a person on one of OFAC's lists, or an entity owned 50% or more by a listed person, or a sanctioned government, or a geographic location where there are broad prohibitions, it's important to know how to identify and understand the specific prohibitions that apply. As you can probably imagine, with so many different sanctions programs built to address so many different foreign policy and national security goals, that can get very granular very quickly. If you do a web search for OFAC programs, one of the top results will usually take you to OFAC sanctions programs and country information page. On that page, you can dive into each program and see what the exact prohibitions are in that program. If you have questions about any of these programs, you can call our OFAC compliance hotline toll-free at 1-800-540-8000. 6322. We also include email contact information on our website too. Okay, so we've got these sanctions, right? Blocking and a variety of non-blocking prohibitions. But how are sanctions created and implemented? How do U.S. policymakers decide who to target? And how does OFAC let you know what sanctions have been imposed? That's exactly what we're going to cover next. Stay tuned.